Hi, this is Ted Morrissey, and I'm making a video for my course in the Long Story and Novella in the Lindenwood University MFA in Writing program. As we get started in this course in earnest, I want to talk a little bit about the novella form and maybe a couple of kind of related matters. And I want to do so primarily by using as the focal point my literary idol William H. Gass, who was a master of the novella, but we'll get into that more so in just a couple of minutes. Um, One of the issues I think that is worth considering from the very start here is whether the novella is a distinct form that one sets out to write, and there are certain sorts of guidelines one can sort of follow as a writer to achieve a well wrought novella? Or is the novella a more organic kind of animal where one just kind of starts writing and ends up with this piece that is in that sort of gray area between the definite short story and definite novel, whether you think of that in terms of page count or word count or in other kinds of means or whatever. Um, I tend to think of it as a more organic process, but yet there are others who seem to speak of the novella, in fact, do speak of the novella as a very distinct art form in and of itself that one can plan to write and go through some process and so forth. Um, and really, even though I've been teaching this course for a few years now, and I've been you know, thinking about the idea of a novella. I've written a couple of novellas of my own and so forth and so on, going back decades. Just very recently, I've begun to ponder this idea of it being a distinct form that one could go through a particular process to write. And what got me thinking about that, in particular, was just, I don't know, maybe 3 weeks ago or so, I was in Albuquerque, New Mexico at the, I always have to think, it's got kind of an unusual title, Southwest Popular / American Culture Association Conference. I think I got that right. Um, and there was a table there set up by the University of New Mexico Press, and one of the books they had on display was a pretty recent release. In fact, as I've gotten to looking into it, it was released in 2021, and it was the book Writing the Novella by Sharon Ord Warner. And again, that's University of New Mexico Press. Now, I actually held this book in hand briefly, but then I, put it back on display. And then when I went back a couple of days later, when they were potentially for sale, someone had already snapped it up. So apparently, it was a popular title. But I have ordered a copy, and I'm waiting for its arrival. But my whole point here is that the idea of devoting an entire book to writing the novella suggests that it is a very distinct kind of form that is somewhat different from the novel and obviously different from the short story. And one can go through a series of guidelines, rules and regs, procedures, techniques, something to arrive at the well wrought novella. Just kind of looking at the book's description online, it, among other things, offers writing exercises to get one on the way to writing a novella. Probably of most interest to me, at least based on the limited information I already have, is that there's a list of novellas, and so I'm curious to see which novellas have made the list as far as this writer is concerned, that are good examples of novellas. So anyway, that's kind of the main issue I want to look at here, and maybe have you respond to whether it's a distinct narrative form in itself, or is it just something that rather happens? As I've said, I've written a couple of books that I definitely think of as novellas or within that sort of range. Um, I think my three, at least, of my novels, if not more, some might try to argue were more in the novella range in terms of length. I think of them as novels, but they kind of run between, say, 48,000 and 52,000 words. Um, and then the only book I have that no one could argue about whether it's a full-fledged novel or not, at least in terms of length, is a book titled An Untimely Frost, and it's well over 100,000 words. And it's the least read of all my books, which is saying something because none of them have been particularly well read. So I don't know if it's the length. I don't know if it's just the timing of when it came out. I was at a point where I didn't have much wherewithal to promote the book and maybe much know-how either. And so that obviously could contribute to that lack of being read as well. But like I said, it's distinctly longer than most of the work I've produced, and even still at 50,000 words or thereabouts, my books tend to take 3 or 4 years to write. So it's a long process. So anyway, I didn't get to bring this book on writing the novella home, but I thought, well, there must be other books like this, and so I went to the old library database, thinking maybe I could, corral another book or two that's devoted to writing the novella, and I didn't find any. And then when I went to Amazon, didn't find any there either. There was one kind of humorously titled book, something about how to write the novella in a day, and then the subtitle was like "and other bad advice for creative writers" or something like that. So that was the only other book I found that seemed to be a how-to manual on writing the novella, other than Warner's book. So it isn't something a lot of people have written about, and so I'm anxious to see what it says when it arrives. But nevertheless, in the meantime, let's talk a little bit about the master, William H. Gass, and his thoughts on the novella. Um, on the one hand, I believe that he was of the belief that the novella is an organic form, that one starts off writing, and then you may end up with something that is a novella. You may end up with something that's a short story. You may end up with something that's clearly a novel. Um, But that said, he did feel like the novella was his particular, kind of writing that he was sort of suited to do. He did the best of all the different kinds of writing that he did, and so on. So I'm going to turn to a couple of quotes that Gass said over the years. He was a generous granter of interviews, and so this is one of my favorite books, Conversations with William H. Gass, which is a collection of several interviews, and this is just the proverbial tip of the iceberg. There are several interviews you can find online that are not collected here, and I would definitely encourage you to seek out as many interviews with the master as you can find, because they're always revelatory. But I've used the heck out of this book over the years, um, and go back to it regularly just for sort of inspiration, and also as the source for things to talk about in videos like this. But this is from an interview in 1997. Gass was born in 1924, passed away in 2017, writing almost up to the bitter end, I might add. Oh, incidentally, a brand new piece has just came out like last week from Gass, obviously posthumously, in the online journal Socrates on the Beach. It's an excerpt from a book he was working on when he passed away, on Baroque prose. And other excerpts from that book that appeared while he was alive came out in the Yale Review and Lit Mag. And then this new piece that just came out last week at Socrates on the Beach. So I encourage you to check it out. But here's what Gass had to say regarding the novella. And this was in the Alaska Quarterly Review. And the interviewer asks, to start the interview, in fact, at least as far as the transcript suggests, how do you assess the vitality of the novella form as it relates to the novel and the short story? Gass replies, Well, that's a difficult question because the novella has always been regarded as a kind of sport, not a main thing, neither short nor long, and so without definition. But I think, in a way, it's the ideal length for the kind of prose which wishes to achieve real, continued tension, the kind of tension that you expect, say, from poetry or a short story, but has ambitions for a longer range. Novellas, I think, are in general far more powerful and have more potentiality for experiment than the short story. I'm thinking of some of the best of Faulkner and James, Henry James, of course. The novella gives you room to really reach for the moon, but you're not going to take years to get there. Now, it's important to note that this interview was just a couple of years after the publication of Gass's novel The Tunnel, which took him 26 years to write. So he definitely was, painfully aware of how long a novel could take to write. And so a novella seems, if for no other reason, a preferred form because of its, brevity compared to the novel. But again, it has ambitions for a longer range, but yet it can achieve real continued tension, says Gass. Um, and again, he really felt like the novella was his kind of natural medium. In another interview from 1995, just a couple of years before, right as The Tunnel had come out, um, he is talking about various projects that he has in the works and things he's going to do now in 1995, since he's finally finished and published The Tunnel after 26 years. He says he was working on some translations of Rilke, but also he says I shall be exploring translation problems. And then he goes on to say, after the past has been laid to rest, I should like to return to my real love, the novella. I think that is what I should have been doing all along, writing storyless stories. So after spending, nearly 3 decades on the tunnel, he says, maybe somewhat jokingly, somewhat ironically, that he should have been, instead of doing that, he should have been writing novellas. Now, he did manage to write several novellas over his long writing career, even though he didn't really start publishing until his 40s. He had been in the Navy, and then he eventually got a master's and a doctorate, and so he was in school for a long time and did a lot of academic writing and critical writing and that kind of thing. So his creative writing took a little longer to kind of come to be, and then to start to be published and to be published on a regular basis. But I'll also mention, briefly here his reference to writing storyless stories. Gass wasn't particularly interested in plot or characterization or setting necessarily. That those were not his chief concerns as a writer. He was more interested in language, in producing beautiful language, and that kind of thing. And so, his writing is definitely a sort of acquired taste. I think most readers who encounter Gass, either they love him or not so much, because if they're definitely looking for a plot-driven narrative with lovable characters, they're not really going to find that in Gass very easily. All right, so he felt like the novella was his sort of natural form, and partly what he meant by that was that when he was writing fiction, that he seemed to kind of write in what he called breaths of, say, 40 to 70 manuscript pages. That he just, for some reason, he just kind of produced texts that, texts that were in that kind of range. And obviously, 40 to 70 manuscript pages is definitely in that sort of novella, length. And his novels, in fact, tended to be sort of chunks of text in that 40 to 70 page range, kind of strung together because of having the same characters or having the same location, or somehow or another they were thematically linked or what have you. And so even his novels tended to be sort of series of novellas that were linked together. Now, having said that, he did write some very specific works that are known as novellas, and I'll just go through the catalog here because I definitely recommend them. Um, in fact, one of his first major publications came out in this book, In the Heart of the Country, and Other Stories, it says. This came out in 1966, and 1968, sorry, 1966 was his first novel. 1968 is this book. And so it says Other Stories, but the sort of anchor piece is this story called, novella really, called The Peterson Kid. And it's thought of as a novella pretty universally. It's obviously longer, very complex. Highly recommend it. It's a great piece of work. The title piece, In the Heart of the Country, that was really the first thing of Gass's that I read. I encountered it in an anthology, in the Norton Anthology of Postmodern Fiction, something like that. Maybe American Postmodern Fiction, something like that. And I read In the Heart of the Country, and I thought of it as a long story, and it really was fairly recently that I realized others considered it a novella. So it's kind of in that murky area. Is it a long short story? Is it a shortish novella? But in any event, it's a great piece of writing. Very experimental. It doesn't follow the rules and regs of a typical narrative. But anyway, there's two pieces in here: the title piece, and then also the Peterson Kid. And the Peterson Kid is definitely considered a novella. And then in 1968, he published a very strange novella called Willie Master's Lonesome Wife. And I've written quite a bit about this odd book, and I've taught it a couple times. It's a difficult text to kind of wrap your head around because Gass plays with a lot of textual features in the book. Just kind of at random here, really. Just almost every page you can open to, there literally are some strange things happening with text and so forth. But anyway, Willie Master's Lonesome Wife came out in 1968, originally as a special supplement to the literary journal Tri-Quarterly, and then it eventually was published by Knopf and published in paperback by other publishers as well. And then in the 90s, kind of while Gass was working on The Tunnel, he also was working on a series of novellas. And so in 1998, Cartesian Sonata was published, and this is a series of 4 novellas. In fact, it's subtitled And Other Novellas. So Cartesian Sonata and Other Novellas. And again, this has 4 different novellas, all of them wonderful. A Cartesian Sonata, of course, Bed and Breakfast, and then a piece that I think Gass really, really liked because he tended to come back to it, and I heard him read from it a couple of times. Emma Enters a Sentence of Elizabeth Bishop's, and then another piece, another novella, The Master of Secret Revenges, is also a part of Cartesian Sonata. And then towards the end, he was working on what was supposed to be a collection of 3 novellas, and he was sort of working on them back and forth. And then one of the novellas kind of got out of hand in terms of length and ended up becoming a full-blown novel, which was published in 2013 as Middle C, the letter C, not S-E-E or S-E-A, the letter C, Middle C. And then shortly thereafter, a last book was published called Eyes, which is novellas and stories. And there's 2 novellas, In Camera and Charity. And those were the other 2 novellas that were intended to be published with the novella that ended up becoming Middle C. And then in addition to In Camera and Charity, there are some other short stories, and maybe really just a sketch or two. So it's a little bit of a potpourri of texts. So as a single volume, they don't have quite the, I don't know, the weight in terms of being linked so closely together as like Cartesian Sonata, for instance. But they're all, of course, terrific, and In Camera and Charity are terrific novellas. So so there are definitely works that fall in that range that we think of as novellas that are very powerful pieces of writing. Again, one of the things I want us to kind of think about, especially here in the beginning, is whether a novella comes about organically. Maybe someone sets out to write a short story and it goes a little long, or maybe somebody sets out to write a full-blown novel, and for whatever reason, they don't quite reach that in terms of length. But nevertheless, it's a powerful piece of writing. Now, we have been talking a little bit already through the discussion board and the announcements and so forth about whether the novella is maybe seeing a bit of a resurgence in terms of popularity because of maybe a combination of factors, maybe people's shorter attention spans, maybe digital publishing, online publishing has added other venues for the short novel or novella, whatever you want to call it, and I think that may be true. Now, to publish something is one thing, but to have people read it is quite another. And whether people are reading more novellas just because perhaps more are being published, that's a whole nother issue, right? While I've got gas in hand, I want to go to kind of a related subject as far as being about creative writing. But I know already there's been a little bit of a discussion. I think it kind of grew out of the video that I posted of John Updike talking about Gertrude and Claudius, and mentioning having his wife read the first draft of his book and that kind of thing. And it brought me to mind the fact that I don't really, I don't like people reading early drafts of things. In my mind, I don't want to kind of put it out into the world until I feel like it's ready. Now, that doesn't mean that I might not come back later and revise it and whatever. But in terms of something being very formative in my mind, I'm not inclined to want to share it with people. I don't really want their feedback. I mean, it's my work or whatever. And by the same token, I'm not one who likes to be edited. And it's not a matter of ego, I don't think, but rather, I've put my effort into this work, and I've spent a lot of time and so forth on it, and it's what I want it to be. Here it is. If you want to publish it, thank you, great. But if not, don't. But don't try to publish some other version of it. Now, I can I can accept some kind of minor suggestions, a word here, a word there. Maybe what about this sentence being a little bit different this way? I had a piece published last fall, and the editor liked the piece but didn't care for the title, and so asked me if I would consider coming up with a new title, and I said okay, and so I gave it some thought and came up with a new title, and I actually kind of like that title better. So when that story appears again, it may have the alternate title and not the original title that I gave it. I'm still kind of thinking about that one. But anyway, so I can take some editorial, encouragement to do this versus that. But as far as fairly wholesale kinds of changes, I feel like if an editor wants that, they don't want the piece that I gave them, and I didn't get that from Gas, but it definitely is something that I could relate to and so forth when I read that, as far as he is concerned, editing is the same as rejecting. He has said it at other times. And then in this interview, kind of on a related matter, this has to do with, again, getting, feedback from people and so forth. Um, this is from early on. This is 1971. Um, but he's asked, do you have any advice for beginning writers? Do you recommend fiction writing classes? Would you ever teach creative writing? If so, what would be your approach? And Gass says, my advice for beginning writers is first to recognize that writers differ a great deal in their own natures and in the nature of their talent, and that little advice which is general can be of much value. Learn not to take advice. Look to yourself. Make yourself worthy of trust. So, this idea that writing is idiosyncratic, and reading and what one responds to positively or not is idiosyncratic. And so, if you're getting feedback from people on what you're writing, you're just getting their sort of idiosyncratic response to what you've shared with them in probably a less than ideal sort of atmosphere, meaning that they're not sitting in a comfortable chair, in a nice quiet room, reading at their leisure. For whatever reason, they're reading it in some other context. And I think oftentimes if you hand someone a manuscript that in the context that this is just something you're working on as a work in progress, and I want your feedback, they are going to look at it assuming that there's something lacking in it, right? And they're going to be looking for things to suggest to do differently, and things that aren't working for them, and those kinds of things. And again, that's setting up the reader with with a different kind of expectation than if you just say, here's my story or my novel or my poem or whatever it is, here it is, world. And I think people will come at it differently in that way. So I really do think that writers need to develop some confidence that what they're doing is what they mean to be doing, and that they can't please everybody. Not every reader is going to respond positively to what they're writing, and so they ultimately have to kind of write for an audience of one. Maybe you have a reader or two in your life that you have a lot of confidence in, and you feel like they can give you good feedback, and if so, that's great. But I am just not one who likes to get feedback, and to me, it's an odd sort of thing. And what I mean by that is, let's say you submit a story to a journal or a publisher or whatever, and they come back and they want changes and so forth. To me, it's as if a gallery says to a painter, "Gosh, we really like this painting. We want to exhibit it, but we really like some more orange in it. Could you put some more orange in it? Or these trees here, we really feel like they need to be bigger. Could you make the trees bigger?" That kind of thing. Or if a bridal boutique were to come back to Vera Wang and say, "Gosh, Vera, we really want to have your fall collection this year, but man, we think the bodices are maybe a little bit too sparkly. Could you take some of the sparkle out of the bodices, and the trains are a little bit long? Could you shorten the trains up a little bit, Vera? That'd be wonderful." We would never do that, right? We look at other art forms and artists, and we accept them, or we don't. We don't come back to them and say, add more orange or shorten the train or whatever it might be, right? So I don't know why with writers, editors, and so on feel like it's perfectly legitimate to say, "Gosh, I really like this piece, but could you take out this character, or give this character more lines, or change these words, or cut this paragraph," or whatever. It's like, that's fine if you don't like the character, don't like the paragraph or whatever. I'm cool with that. Just don't publish it, because you don't want to publish this thing. You want to publish some version that's partly your own and partly mine. And if I wanted to co-write this story with you, I would have contacted you in the first place. So anyway, those are just some of Gass's thoughts, some of my thoughts, and so forth. I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about any of that, either the novella as a distinct form or something that's maybe more organically arrived at, maybe some of your thoughts on editing, on getting feedback to your writing, that kind of thing, and so on. I'll keep an eye out for writing the novella when it arrives. I will, maybe share some of its wisdom with you through another video or through notes on the announcements or something like that. All right, so I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing from you down the road.